because that's what kind means, right? It's an extension of the word kin. But that doesn't work well in larger groups. You need other principles. And so you look at something like the idea of equity, which is equality of outcome rather than equality of opportunity. On the surface of it, it seems perfectly reasonable to say, well, if every resource isn't distributed absolutely equally to every group, then the system is unfair. And on the face of it, that's a reasonable proposition, but it falls apart under minimal examination. So here's something to think about for everyone who thinks that equality of an outcome is a good idea. It's like, why the hell are you striving for anything then? Because the reason anyone strives to better themselves or to develop a skill or to move forward in life at all is to produce inequality. You're trying to rise above the mediocre masses every time you make an effort at anything. And so everything that we associate positive movement forward to or positive motivation is actually an attempt to render the world more unequal. Now, you're rendering it unequal in a just way, right? Because we might say, well, if you work really hard, you deserve an unequal outcome. Well, yeah, unless you want people to stop working hard. And that was the old joke in the Soviet Union, you know. They pretend to pay us, we pretend to work. So it's so thoughtless. That's the problem.
That is a big problem with the phrase income inequality. You never hear effort inequality because effort is not the same.
Oh, well, you know, on some campuses, and this is true in California, it's now considered a form of aggression. It's classified under the microaggression to say that hard work is one of the reasons that people accumulate more value, accumulate more property, accumulate more money. It's an aggression. It's aggressive to say that because it implies that people who are poor don't work hard. Now, see, that's another terribly fuzzy form of thinking because there are lots of reasons for people to not have money, many, to be poor, let's say, which is even different than not having money. Alcoholism, drug addiction, mental illness, physical illness, intellectual incapacity, and lack of work. All of those things contribute.
Also environmental factors, communities you grow up into, what you're being exposed to. People imitate their atmosphere. You're around people that are constantly in trouble with the law, and you're dealing with horrible environments. There's a lot of factors.
Yeah.
And I think that one of the things that's really important about having these discussions is that they break down these rigid ideologies that a lot of these kids that are going to these universities are sort of being shoved into. They're being shoved into these ideologies. You're either on the left or you're on the right, and there's very few on the right. There's no open market of ideas when it comes to discussing these things. You're compelled and enforced into certain categories.
Jonathan Haidt he's a psychologist at the New York University Business School. He's done a really good job of documenting the dearth of ideological viewpoints, let's say political or temperamental viewpoints, because that's more accurate, in the modern university. And it's appalling because along with all this push for ethnic and sexual and racial diversity, which I think is just a mask to enforce a kind of ideological homogeneity, there's no even understanding that ideational diversity is the only relevant value for a university. The rest of it's all predicated, say, on the assumption that if you do select people because of their ethnicity or racial background or gender, that will in and of itself produce diversity of ideas, which is another really pernicious idea because it assumes that, and it's so contradictory. The left describes anything that's associated with the assumption that someone who's female, for example, will think in a female way. They regard that as an unreasonable prejudice. Yet they're perfectly reasonable to say that we need more women in X discipline because they will bring in female ideas. It's like, well, what the hell are female ideas? You can't have it both ways unless you're completely, unless you don't care at all about coherence or consistency, and ideologues really don't because they care about putting their ideology forth. But the idea that you're going to get a diversity of ideas because you have a diversity of class of people assumes that ideas and identity are the same thing, and that's an absurd proposition. In fact, that's an essentially racial racist proposition. Black people think differently than white people. It's no, some do and some don't, and the overlap is substantive, and the difference between the individuals is far greater than the difference between the groups.
I think we also need to make a very clear distinction between discrimination and people that are just inclined to gravitate towards different careers and different focuses. There's a big difference between women being forced out of tech and women being not as compelled to enter into tech careers as men. But
yeah, well, the tech issue is a really interesting one for a couple of reasons. I mean, one is that, of course, high tech basically developed after the playing field for men and women was more or less leveled. I mean, that happened in the 1970s. And despite that, there aren't anywhere near as many women in tech. There's far more women in caring professions, and you see that particularly in Scandinavia, where they've done everything they can to equalize the playing field. It's 20 to 1 female to male nurses and 20 to 1 male to female engineers.
Explain that if you could, the Scandinavia issue, because it's very interesting what they've done over there and what the results have been.
Yeah, well, imagine that there are two reasons that people differ. There are more than two, but just imagine for the time being that there are two. One is for environmental reasons, cultural reasons, and the other is for biological reasons. What happens if you flatten out the environmental reasons, which is what's happened in Scandinavia, is you maximize the biological differences. You don't get rid of them, you maximize them. And so what's happened in Scandinavia is that men and women are more different from a temperament and personality perspective, and also in terms of their interests. They're more different in Scandinavia than they are anywhere else in the world.
Now, what have they done to try to flatten things out, as you say?
Well, they've transformed their social policies so that men and women have as close to equal opportunity, say, as any society has managed. But that hasn't produced the hoped-for equality of outcome. Quite the contrary. In many situations, it's exaggerated it. And you could say that that's actually okay, is that what you want is to have a society where the genuine differences between people are free to manifest themselves. So, for example, if you have 3 or 4 kids, say, the kids are going to be different from one another genetically. That's why they're not identical twins. They differ genetically. And if you set the environment up so that each child is supportive, the children actually turn out quite differently. Now, if you're an absolute brute and you beat them and you abuse them, then they'll all turn out the same because there's tremendous environmental influence on them then. But if you form an individual relationship with each of them and allow their strengths to manifest themselves as they will in a supportive environment, then the kids are going to turn out very different. And so a free society is actually one that produces massively unequal outcomes because it allows the genuine differences between people to manifest themselves. These people who are pushing equity, which is equality of outcome, that's what the word equity codes for, by the way, equality of outcome and not equality of opportunity. I don't know what in the world they do with regards to the fact that a very large number of professions are, high quality, high pay professions are female dominated. Physicians, for example, psychologists, any of the disciplines that have to do with human care are almost inevitably dominated by women, and that's increasingly the case. Is we're supposed to stop that? Is that also a sign of oppression? We're going to force women to do things they're not interested in?
Well, there's also a very disingenuous way of framing it here in America where people consistently, even the President of the United States, Obama, was talking about income inequality. And the way they frame income inequality, they talk about the 79 cents to the dollar. But what they don't discuss is that we're talking about completely different careers. We're not. The way they frame it, they frame it as if two people are working side by side. One is a man, one is a woman. They're both doing the same job. The man makes $1, the woman makes 79 cents.
Yeah.
That is not the case.
Well, it's typical of ideological conversation because what happens technically, like imagine that we talked about poverty a few minutes ago and we said, well, there's many, many reasons that one person might have more money than another. There are many, many reasons why women might make less money on average than men. There are small businesses that women run, for example, make far less money than small businesses that men run. But that's partly because a lot of women run their businesses part-time because they have kids. It's also partly because men do all the horrible, dangerous jobs, the ones where there's a high chance of dying. Men are much more likely to work outside. Men are much more likely to move in pursuit of a career opportunity. There are lots of reasons that men and women differ in terms of their income. But if you're an ideologue, you can only handle one variable. Oh, men and women measured en masse don't have the same incomes. Therefore, the system is corrupt.
Right.
Jesus, how much thinking does it take to come up with with a theoretical scenario like that. It's so boneheaded, and it just pushes the ideological, it just pushes the ideology forward with no thought.
Now, as a professor, why is this sort of objective reasoning and really absolutely honest assessment of this situation, why is this so rare amongst professors? Why is this so rare in universities? Why is this such an unusual subject?
Well, I think the reason is that when people first encounter a complex topic like income differences, it's like, imagine you were drawing a map of a territory and you don't know the territory very well. The first thing you do is just roughly sketch out the shapes of the continents. And maybe you're wrong, like the early European maps of North America. You know, you kind of get one coastline right and you guess in the rest. It's blurry and gray. And then as you investigate more and more, your picture of the situation becomes higher and higher and higher and higher in resolution. It's hard to go from a low resolution representation to a high resolution representation. And ideologies are low resolution representations. So the thing about a low resolution representation is it looks like it covers everything. But it doesn't. The closer you look, the more details there are. You know, if you get a 3-year-old to draw a helicopter, they put like a little cross on the top and a circle and a stick and another circle, and that's the helicopter. Well, you know when you look at it that it's a helicopter, but no one would expect that thing to fly. If you want to change that into a real model of a helicopter, you have to increase your focus and concentration on every single element of the entity, and that takes a tremendous amount of cognitive effort. And sometimes you don't even know what you don't know about something. You know, I could say, well, there are 50 reasons why men and women's income differ. Well, that doesn't mean I can say all 50 of those differences, and each of those 50 differences are fragmentable into maybe another dozen categories each. Maybe there's 600 reasons why men and women's salary differ. But you have to spend a tremendous amount of time paying attention and thinking to build your model of reality into that level of resolution. And basically what you do is default to temperamentally influenced ideologies. They give you a one-bit answer to everything. Why do men and women's salaries differ? Oppression. It's always the same thing, and it makes you feel like you know something. And people like that because they don't like the feeling that there's something they don't know. They don't like to be in chaos. That's basically chaos. They like to be in order, and order is where you know everything. So, and professors are no different than people, obviously, given that they're people. Maybe they're more intelligent on average. They're also more sheltered, I would say, in many ways on average. And they're also not challenged as often.
Tenure's an issue, and also not competing in the marketplace, not being in the workforce, going from being in high school to being in universities to getting a degree to teaching to being a professor to getting tenure, staying inside of that intellectual bubble.
Yeah, well, it's complicated. Often these things happen. They're like positive feedback loops, you know, when you bring a speaker too close to, or a microphone too close to a speaker and it starts to howl. And I think something like that's happened in the universities, is that they started to tilt towards the left in the 60s. And then as they tilted harder. And as they tilted harder, they tilted even harder until all of the diversity was forced out of the universities. And I don't know if it's so much a consequence of the actual policies of the university as just a feedback process that got out of control. I mean, if it's 50% liberals and 50% conservatives, no problem. But if it's 70% liberals and 30% conservatives, maybe it rapidly goes to 99% liberals and 1% conservatives.
Is that what it's like right now? I mean, when you look at the University of Toronto, where you are, what is the number, if you had a guess?
Well, it would depend to some degree on the discipline, but professors are also tend to be characterized by personality traits that do tilt them towards liberalism. They're higher in trait openness, which is both creativity and interest in ideas. That's one of the things that temperamentally distinguishes liberals from conservatives. Conservatives are more conscientious. They're more orderly and industrious. Liberals are more open, so they're more interested in aesthetics and ideas. And of course, being interested in aesthetics and ideas does tilt you towards an academic career. It's hard to tell. I mean, it's certainly the bulk of intellectuals are liberal and liberal left. virtually all of them, I would say. And that's probably not as true. We know this. It's not as true in the hard sciences. But in the social sciences and the humanities, it's the overwhelming majority. I mean, I could see that even in this battle that I've been in Canada with regards to Bill C-16 and these compelled pronouns. I've had almost no support from my faculty colleagues. Now, I didn't expect any. I mean, and I'm not shocked by that. But it's an indication that if you put to them a choice between social justice / all-consuming compassion and freedom of expression, they're going to tilt hard towards the social justice compassion end of things.
But it almost seemed like when I was watching some of the debates that you've engaged in, it almost seems like they're politicians. It almost seems like they're wetting their finger and going with the breeze. There's some conversations that you had that were just, I had to stop and rewind them because I couldn't believe the arguments. There was a woman, I don't know, it was was it a transgender man that you were having a discussion with that was saying that there's no difference, no biological difference in the sexes?
Yeah, no biological difference. He said that scientific
Is that a
consensus for the last
transgender?
I'm not sure. I don't believe so. He was a professor who taught transgender studies at the University of Toronto. And yeah, and he said outright that there were no biological differences between men and women and that was the scientific consensus. And he believed that he had the qualifications to say that because he was a historian of medicine, which hardly qualifies as a scientist. Not that you have to be a scientist to notice that there are biological differences between men and women. It was very bizarre for me at that point in the last few months because I was under substantial pressure from the university to stop repeating my claim that I wouldn't use compelled pronouns to refer to people, because the university regarded that as against the university policies and also against the Ontario Human Rights Code, so also illegal. And as my employers, they're responsible for everything I say, whether or not there has been a complaint made, whether or not the consequence of my speech is intended or unintended, because that's built into the legislation. And believe me, that's coming your way, because this legislation spreads like mad. But on the one hand, I got 2 letters of warning from the university for refusing to use these compelled pronouns, which I regard as the ideological constructions of radical left-wingers. And this professor went on the agenda, this Ontario news show, and announced publicly that there were no biological differences between men and women. It was like, you'd think maybe the university would have had something to say about that, since they do in fact have a biology department. But oh no, that went by without notice. That was perfectly fine. It's insane.
It's such an insane thing to say. If there's no biological difference, then why are they taking hormones?
Well, that's a good question. Why bother with the surgery and especially the hormones?
Yeah.
Because that's not, like, you could argue with surgery that's cosmetic, right?
Yeah. This person, whoever this professor was, is expert in transgender studies.
Nicholas Matt.
I'm pretty sure that used to be a woman, or she, they. You're not allowed to say that. If you say that, you're a bad person. If you say they. And they and them is the most reasonable of these these alternative pronouns, they and them. Like you could say, if you know a guy and he doesn't know how to swim, they should probably stay out of the pool.
Right.
You could say that. You could
yes.
use that in a non-plural form.
Yes, and they is used to repair awkward sentences, basically.
Yes.
But it's never been used, despite the claims of the gender bender activists. It's never been used for the singular, and we shouldn't give up the distinction.
Language,
we shouldn't give up the distinction between the plural and the singular.
No, it's
we
ridiculous.
Actually need to know whether it's one person or more than one person.
Do you think it's reasonable for people that are asexual, people that really are uncomfortable with the idea of being a man or a woman, is it reasonable that we come up with a distinction for that? I mean, that seems like it would be nice, and this is one of the things that you've said. One of the things that you don't like about this is that you're being compelled to use these made-up pronouns, and that if we as a society, as a culture, as a civilization sort of adopt a new phrase, that you would be fine with that.
Well, we kind of had one. We had transsexual.
Yeah, but
I know.
that's problematic because it's not asexual. You know, transsexual would be transition. And here's the other distinction. This is another important thing. Those aren't the people that have the problem with it. The people that have the problem with these pronouns, the transsexual community almost entirely, or at least, I shouldn't say entirely, but predominantly prefer the alternative pronoun.
Yeah, right.
A male to female transgender person prefers to be called a woman or she and use the female pronouns.
It's
male,
the whole point.
Yes.
Yeah, so there's some tiny
Exactly.
fraction of the transsexual community, or we could say there's some tiny fraction of people who are identifying themselves with the transgender community, which is already a tiny fraction, who claims that they have an identity that doesn't fit into either binary category.
Right.
Well, it's a proposition that I think bears some scrutiny to begin with, because I don't believe that the claims that that tiny community is making are coherent in any sense, because they say, well, you could be man, woman, or neither, or both. Those aren't coherent claims in my estimation. And if what they're saying is that we don't fit into a category and therefore we get to invent our own plurality of categories. It's not logically tenable. That isn't how it works, because you get an infinite number of categories out of that. And that's what's happening already online.
One of my favorite stories came out of an all-girls university in Massachusetts, where a group of women, where they were trying to pick a president of the student body or whatever, and one of the girls who went to that school decided that she identified as a man, so she changed her name, and I don't believe there was any hormones or anything involved. I think she just changed her name. She called herself Masculine of Center Genderqueer, changed her name to a masculine name, ran for president of whatever the hell this is.
I think it was Wellesley.
Won. Yes, I believe you're right. Won, and then was denounced by the rest of the class, because now she was a white male, so she was a part of the patriarchy, and she was a part of the whole problem with society, and that she should not be allowed, or he should not be allowed to take that position, which
Well, that's a really good example.
We've read it on air, and I couldn't stop laughing.
Right. Well, that's a really good example of the chaos that ensues when you start to blow apart standard categories. There's a chaos in between categories that's made of an infinite multiplicity. That's why you see, too, with the LGBT rainbow, they're getting caught in their own metaphor. So there's an infinite number of gradations in a rainbow, and there's an infinite number of letters that are accumulating on the LGBT rainbow, and there's an element of clear absurdity to that, and one of them is, I believe it's Q+, that includes the other kin types. It's like, well, the claim is, well, I'm marginalized, and then that sort of becomes normalized, and then there's a group right outside of that that says, well, I'm marginalized too, and another group says, well, I'm also marginalized. And there's absolutely no logic. Once you've identified yourself as marginalized, there's no logical way that you can exclude anyone else who regards themselves as marginalized. And so the marginalized, the community of the marginalized expands and expands and expands and expands. And part of the reason for that is that every individual is a multiplicity. And there's an element to every individual that's marginalized. So for example, it's clearly the case that when a child is socialized, there's pros and cons to that. The pros are the socialization turns the little beastly 2-year-old into a 4-year-old that other children can play with. And that does happen between the ages of 2 and 4 if a child is socialized properly. And then what the child does is kind of turn into a clone of everyone else so that he or she can benefit from being able to interact with everyone else. Now that builds up a certain amount of individuality, because kids learn to talk and they learn to play and all that. And it destroys a certain amount of individuality. So everybody sacrifices a certain portion of their peculiarity to become a socialized creature. And some of that's good and some of it's bad. And we know that. That's the standard story of the rebellious adolescent against society for crushing their individuality, right? And there's an element of that that's true. But by the same token, if you don't sacrifice a certain amount of your individuality to the group, there's no such thing as society. Everybody has to live on their own. Everyone is in their own subjective bubble, which is of course now required by this law. And society itself breaks down. And so you can't have a society without marginalizing people, or you can't have a society without making everyone, part of everyone, marginalized. And so then when you start to concentrate on the marginalized, it just grows and expands and grows and expands and grows and expands until everyone becomes marginalized.
And that just highlights a real problem with quote mining. That someone is going to take that, you can't have a society without marginalizing people, quote, and put it under Dr. Jordan Peterson, this is what he believes.
Right, well that's actually what Jacques Derrida said, the most famous of the postmodernists. That's why Derrida is such a invasive force. He said, well, you can't have a society without marginalizing. It's like, well, that's true. It's true, comma, but, ... right? But the fact that you can't have a society without marginalizing doesn't mean that you shouldn't have a society. And it doesn't mean that the only reason that society exists is to marginalize. And that was Derrida's claim. That's what makes him so... He's absolutely pathological to the core, Jacques Derrida. And apart from his claims that all we do is trade power games, because that's another one of his claims, his other claim is that the purpose of categorization, the purpose of society is to marginalize. And that's absolutely absurd. The purpose is so that we can all play a moderately mediocre but productive, homogeneous social game. Is it perfect? Well, obviously not. Does it require the sacrifice of individuality? Yes. Is some of that sacrificed individuality valuable? Absolutely. What's the alternative? No society. Well, I don't think so. That doesn't seem like a very good alternative to me. Or maybe some sort of egalitarian utopia. Well, yeah, we had 100 years of that, and 100 million deaths as a consequence. And so maybe not that either. What we have right now is a flawed system. But it's the best flawed system that anybody's ever come up with. And of course it marginalizes people. How could it not? You know, if kids organize themselves in a playground to play hide and go seek, they've marginalized all the kids that wanted to play tag. Obviously. But that doesn't mean that they shouldn't come to a consensus and go ahead and play a game. At least they're bloody well playing a game that you know, pretty much everybody has access to.
I think marginalized is a lot of times associated with oppression. That term marginalized, and it's not necessarily the case. And I think that society as a whole and civilization is sort of a work in progress. We're working all this out, and that's one of the beautiful things about you being able to discuss these things on your YouTube page, as opposed to just having to battle it out inside the echo chamber of the universities. You're able to express this stuff out in the world where people like me that are 49 years old and aren't in college have a chance to read this and see like, wow, what is this guy going through over there at the University of Toronto? And then you start to examine the laws and you start to look at what's going on here. And this egalitarian utopia idea, it's beautiful in its concept that we should all be able to get along and everything should be equal. The problem is it defies human nature. It defies the 200, 300,000 years of DNA that we have bouncing around inside of our bodies that demand certain types of behavior. And I think it's so important that we discuss these things. And I think that society and civilization as a whole, this thing that is ultimately in this growing state, this constant state of improvement and objective interaction. I mean, there has to be some sort of discussion. One of the problems that I have with the so-called social justice warriors and with this movement is that they're enforcing a certain type of thinking and behavior, and they're incredibly aggressive about it, hence the warrior term.
Yeah, well, I think a fair bit of that is grounded again in temperament, which is quite comical. I mean, one of the things that our research on political correctness indicated that this trait agreeableness is a good predictor of holding politically correct views, and also that being female is a good predictor of holding politically correct views. And I think part of the reason for that, and the warrior aspect to it too, is that agreeableness is a maternal instinct trait, roughly speaking. And you know, human beings have very powerful maternal instincts. That's true for women and for men, because men are very involved. Male human beings are very involved in the raising of their children, which makes them quite different than many large animals. On the one hand, if you're very maternal, you're very compassionate and protective of those that are within your kin boundary. And you can try to include more people in that if you want. And that's the political goal. But you're unbelievably hostile to anyone who's outside of that you regard as a threat/predator. And so agreeableness makes you divide the world up into protected children and predators.
And you see that on social justice warriors' Twitter pages. I mean, I follow a bunch of them, and I go to them and I watch this, incredibly supportive, to ridiculously so, of in terms of like mediocre expressions, tweets. Oh my God, it's so brilliant, and
Yeah.
it's like you're saying almost nothing.
Yeah.
And they're so incredibly supportive of the people that think along their lines, and so incredibly hostile and this idea of shaming people that don't agree with them, not interacting with them, but almost immediately insulting them, almost immediately marginalizing them, which is ironic. This is what you see constantly. Is like super supportive and super aggressive against people that have any sort of an opposing viewpoint.
Yeah, well, they're all predators, the ones that have an opposing viewpoint.
And that's how they define them.
It's one of the things that's very comical about this, from my perspective, is that it's such sex stereotypical behavior, is that at the same time that the social justice warriors are denouncing the idea that psychology, for example, might have anything to do with sex differences, they're acting out sex stereotype behavior like mad in terms of their persecution of predators and their protection of the kin/in group. So.
And you were a social psychologist?
No, I'm not. I'm a clinical personality psychologist.
What is the difference?
Well, one of the differences is that personality and clinical psychology isn't a corrupt enterprise, whereas social psychology fundamentally is. It's been going through an absolute internal revolution over the last 2 years because of its own discovery that many of its fundamental studies and propositions are flawed. I would say social psychology is the most social justice / left-leaning part of psychology, and its methods are generally appalling. They're not well documented, and they produce all sorts of categories that don't exist. Whereas personality, I know it might seem like trivial distinction to people outside of the field, but these disciplines are quite separate from a historical perspective. They develop quite separately. Personality psychologists are very, very careful about defining what they measure. And so, for example, I study the big 5 personality traits. That's extroversion, neuroticism, agreeableness, conscientiousness, openness, and under openness falls intelligence. These are very well documented. We can really measure them. We can't measure them as well as we would like to. We've identified the biological basis for most of the traits, and we understand a fair bit about how they make people different. And personality psychologists have been very, very careful about measurement, whereas social psychologists are, as a general rule, very, very cavalier about their concepts, and that's led to a tremendous pollution, I would say, of the psychological literature. The implicit association test is a good example of that. That's the test that's being used to assess people's unconscious biases, unconscious racial biases. And so, for example, if I showed you a bunch of pictures of black people and a bunch of photographs of white people, and then I asked you to associate a good or a bad word with the black people or the white people, to respond after you've seen the picture. If you are white and you saw white photos, you'd be faster at responding to the positive words. And so they've used that as evidence of racism. But part of the problem with that is that you can't distinguish it from a novelty response. So, I mean, most people in a given racial group are far more familiar with members of their racial group. And the fact that they're more likely to associate negative things with racial groups that are outside of their racial group isn't something that can be easily distinguished from just a novelty effect. But they make wide-ranging claims about the inbuilt biases in people, and that's lent impetus to these movements that are racing through corporations across the United States and governmental agencies, where people are being subjected to mandatory unconscious racial bias training. And there's no evidence, by the way, that works at all. In fact, the evidence that there is suggests quite the contrary.
I saw this on one of your videos. You were discussing how preposterous this is on one of your videos, because one of the people that was opposing you was actually a part of something like this, right?
Yeah, well, the human resources and equity people at the University of Toronto have made mandatory unconscious racism training, anti-bias training, they've made it mandatory for their staff. And I found that absolutely appalling. First of all, it's political re-education.
So when you say mandatory, like this is something that you had engaged in?
No, I didn't have to, because I'm not part of the human resources staff.
Oh, okay.
But the people that they're consulting with to implement these sorts of programs certainly have faculty and students in their sights. I mean, these are trial runs for much broader rolling out of exactly this sort of of exactly this sort of re-education
What's
process.
the methodology behind it, and how's this been vetted?
Oh, I don't think it's been vetted at all. Like, if you're going to, let's say you want to put into practice an educational process, what you need to do is you need to measure the initial state validly so that your measure, so you need to use multiple measures, and all those measures need to say the same thing. So if you're going to accuse someone of racism, you need several different measures of racism, and then you have to show that across all the measures, it's like using different meters. All the meters should read the same thing. Then you have to implement your educational intervention, carefully defined. Then you have to see afterwards if the consequence of the educational effort was a reduction in those initial indices, those initial measures, that sort of thing. When it's been done at all, has showed that educational interventions of that sort that are mandatory actually make racism and bias worse rather than better. But why let a few facts stop you? Because we already know from the postmodernists that there's no such thing as facts anyways.
So there's...
Look, in Canada, here's something. This is one of the things that really makes me proud of my country. Our government has now announced that the judiciary in Canada will be selected. If you're going to be a candidate to be a judge, you have to produce a dossier that specifies your identities, whatever they happen to be, racial, ethnic, religious, and then the committee that's going to appoint you to the judiciary has to have undergone mandatory anti-racism and bias training before they're allowed to serve on the committee. So basically, we've set up a situation in Canada where the people who select our judges have to go a kind of indoctrination that has no validity from a scientific perspective before they're allowed to select our judges.
Now, who's enforcing this? Where did this come from?
The Justice Minister. The Federal Justice Minister.
Where did this program come from?
Oh, yeah, there's all sorts of people who are offering these programs now.
And so
it's become a growth industry.
But what is their qualifications? That's a good question, right? None.
Qualifications.
Zero.
Yeah,
huh?
yeah.
The eyebrows are raised.
Yeah, well, there's no way of having qualifications for doing this sort of thing because it's not a valid procedure.
So how do
people
they
who claim to be qualified?
So they claim to be qualified. They come to the university and they say I have a solution. The university says finally, just run with it, and
That's
they just
exactly
implement it because to question anything that would absolve racism is racist.
Yes, right. Yes, and they did that in collaboration with the Black Liberation Collective, which
Explain that one, because that one's adorable. The Black Liberation Collective, isn't that the group that somehow thinks that white people are inferior because they don't have enough melanin?
Yeah,
so they
it was
started
by a woman who said exactly that. She's a black supremacist, and she said that the reason that white people are inferior is because they don't have enough melanin in their skin, and melanin apparently is this agent. It's a pigment, but it's apparently this agent that transforms cosmic energy into wisdom. I mean, she's completely... You can make up your own mind about her, and then the other person who started the Black Liberation Collective is a woman who used to work for the University of Toronto Students' Union, who is now being pursued by that students' union for embezzling $300,000 from that organization with the help of a couple of her cronies.
Well, why let a few facts stand in the way of abolishing racism?
Yeah, well, they also are perfectly willing to promote violent means of social transformation, and the university claims that it's in favor of safety, because they've gone after me because my refusal to use compelled pronouns has apparently made the campus unsafe. But they're perfectly willing to take advice from the Black Liberation Collective, and not only are they willing to take advice from them and not disavow them despite their support for violent means of social revolution, they're also pushing equality of outcome on their employees. And the people who taught their mandatory anti-racism and anti-bias training program said outright in their training material, which I have copies of, that any institution that doesn't have equality of outcome as part of its characteristic at every level of the power organization is corrupt and should be restructured. But that pales in comparison to my refusal to use compelled pronouns, obviously.
I just don't understand how this gets so far. I just don't understand how no one has... There's no rational thinking involved in the administration and the people that are implementing these ideas. I just don't understand how it gets to the point where...
Well, things get to terrible places one tiny step at a time. If I encroach on you and I'm sophisticated about it, I'm going to encroach 2 millimeters. I'm going to encroach right to the point where you start to protest. Then I'm going to stop. Then I'm going to wait. Then you're going to calm down. Then I'm going to encroach again, right to the point where you protest. Then I'm going to stop. Then I'm going to wait. And I'm just going to do that forever. And before you know it, you're going to be back 3 miles from where you started, and you'll have done it one step at a time. And then you'll go, oh, how'd I get here? And the answer was, well, I pushed you a little farther than you should have gone, and you agreed. And so then I pushed you a little farther than you should have gone again, and you agreed. And if anybody's interested in this sort of process, and this is a horrifying book, if you want to read about how this process works, you can read a book called Ordinary Men by Robert Browning. And Ordinary Men is about, Browning was interested in how the Nazis trained how they trained people to kill, basically. And so Robert Browning studied this police battalion. It's a very interesting book. So these were middle-aged German men. So they were raised and educated really before Hitler came to power. So they weren't indoctrinated Nazis. They were policemen. And when the Nazis went through Poland and then needed to impose their brand of order on Poland, they brought policemen in. They brought this battalion of middle-aged policemen in. And their commandant, their commander, was by all accounts a pretty decent guy, and he told them that because it was wartime they were probably going to have to do some pretty terrible things, but that they could go home if they didn't think they were up to it. So there was no compulsion. You know, this wasn't a Milgram experiment or an experiment where you had to obey orders. The guy who was giving the orders said, look, this is going to be awful, but you can back off. But the guys thought, well, I'm not going to leave my comrades here to do the dirty work, you know, which is kind of a virtue in a perverse way. And then Browning details how they went from ordinary policemen to guys who were taking naked pregnant women out into the middle of fields and shooting them in the back of the head. And they were physically ill during most of the transformation process. You know, they started out by rounding up the Jewish men between the ages of 16 and 65. Well, you know, you can kind of understand that because you're at war. And then, well, then they put them in stadiums. And then, well, then they had to shoot some of them. And then they had to load them on cattle cars. It was like one step at a time. These guys were having a dreadful time of it. They didn't stop. They didn't stop. And so that's how things get to where they are now, is that, I mean, you know, they're not at that point. And I'm not trying to make the case that they're at that point.
Well, you're one of the first people that's sounding an alarm, that there's a real issue with controlling people. There's a real issue with controlling dialogue, controlling the way people communicate, and that these ideologies, although seemingly innocuous, they can take you down very dangerous roads.
Yes, well, seemingly innocuous ideology. Those words, innocuous ideology, those words do not go together. There are no innocuous ideologies. And they're forms of pathological oversimplification, and they're also clubs. I mean the kind of clubs that you hit people with, as well as the clubs that you belong to. The advantage to me being an ideologue is that I can explain everything. I can feel morally superior, and I know who my enemies are. And you know what you're supposed to do with enemies. They're not your friends, right? You move against them. And, you know, we're approaching a situation, and this has already happened, I think, more in the United States than in Canada, although our countries are competing to see who can cross the idiot line fastest. You're in a situation in the U.S. where 50% of your population won't talk to the other 50%. That's not good, and I would say it's more pronounced on the left liberal side because they regard everybody who voted for Trump as essentially as an enemy. It's like, hey, people, that's 50% of your citizens. You might think about talking with them. You know, people you can't talk to, those are enemies.
Well, ironically, I really truly believe that one of the big factors in Trump's rise to power is that people are sick of this oversimplification and this ridiculous ideology coming from the left. Like that this enforcing
they're sick of identity politics.
Exactly. And so they've chosen an identity politics that opposes the identity politics that they think is disgusting.
Yeah, and that's just starting.
It's just starting.
Yeah, that's
it
right.
is just starting.
That's right. Well, if you teach one side to play identity politics, de facto you teach the other side to play identity politics. And I've seen more and more people who are center people, as far as I'm concerned, pushed to the right.
Yes.
Because of the continual insistence that by their mere existence they're part of the perpetrator group.
Just by being a white person who is somehow or another successful, you are a privileged person, you're part of the elite, you're part of the 1%, you're part of the problem.
Yeah, you're part of the oppressors.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
You're an
And-
oppressor by being just
by
a person
being.
with a home in the suburbs.
Well, and it's also extremely annoying for people who've worked really hard and who've made the requisite sacrifices to become successful along some dimension, to have that immediately attributed to their oppression. And it's not obvious that that's something we want to do. It's like, for the social justice warrior types out there who might be listening, it's like, are you really willing to say that every single person who's accomplished something has done that as a consequence of oppression? That's again what the Soviets claimed with regards to the successful peasants just before the 1920s. It's like, well, the peasants weren't emancipated. They were serfs until about 30 years before that. They were serfs. They were basically slaves. And some of them had clambered up to the point where maybe they could own their hut and a cow and could, employ someone. Well, the Soviet claim was, well, that's all theft. You got that all because you're an oppressor. And so then the Soviet intellectuals went into the villages, and just imagine how this happened. So imagine a village, a small town where everyone knows everybody, and there's maybe 10, 20 people there who are moderately successful. Okay, and so you can imagine that those 20 people have like 100 enemies at the bottom of the socioeconomic distribution. Useless, horrible people who are jealous and resentful about the fact that these people have been successful. Okay, so now the intellectuals come in and say, property is theft, success is oppression. And then they look for the people in the village who are willing to move against those 20 successful people. Well, those guys at the bottom, those 100 resentful, jealous, murderous people at the bottom, they're just waiting for an opportunity to go kick down some doors. And that's exactly what they did in the 1920s. And as I said, they wiped out all their productive peasants. And then 6 million Ukrainians starved to death. They had posters. The Soviets produced posters in the 1930s that said, essentially, don't forget, it's wrong to eat your children. So,
Whoa.
yeah, whoa. There's nothing about there's nothing that you can imagine that's horrible enough so that it matched the reality of what happened in the Soviet Union between 1919 and 1959. And the West knew about this too. Early, Malcolm Muggeridge in the 30s was documenting for England, for English newspapers, exactly what was going on in the Soviet Union. Bloody intellectuals didn't admit it till the mid-70s, with the exception of people like George Orwell. So,
why do these patterns repeat themselves? What is it about human beings?
well, we like things simple. We like things simple. So, and then you often, like, a simple explanation is a good explanation unless it's too simple, but distinguishing between simple and too simple is no easy matter. We like to know who's our friend and who's our enemy, and we like the feeling of unearned moral superiority. And then
Unearned moral superiority.
yeah,
That's the
why earn it,
distinction.
man? Especially when there's no such thing as earning anyways. So, and then, there's deeper and darker things that are underneath that. It's like the human proclivity to pull down those who have more than you. It's like these kids on the campuses who are claiming identity with the oppressed, at somewhere like Yale. It's like, how in the world you can speak of oppression if you happen to be at Yale is beyond me. First of all, you're North American, which puts you in the top 1%. And then of North Americans, you're in the top 1%. So you're in the top 1% of 1%. But yet you want that. You want to have all the power that goes along with that. And you want to have the moral superiority that comes from being a representative of the oppressed. So that's exactly what you want. You want all the power and you want all the victimization at the same time.
Well, Yale's a great example because Yale was one of what happened with the Halloween costume debacle at Yale was one of the first videos that was released that made people horrified, where they couldn't believe how students were communicating with professors.
Yeah, well, the student who screamed up a storm about that, the male professor, who was the husband of the woman who wrote the pro-Halloween costume letter, it turned out she was on the bloody hiring committee that hired him. One of the things she screamed was, "Who hired you?" It's like, well, it turned out it was you because you were on the committee just a few years before. I know, and they took, yeah, that was absolutely
Explain that
appalling.
to people that don't know what the hell we're talking about.
Well,
Explain this debacle, because it really was about questionable Halloween costumes.
Well, it was about questioning Halloween costumes. Halloween costumes are part of the whole point of Halloween is to have questionable costumes, right? You play with death, for example, and decay and horror. And it's a time when the norms with regards to the expression of things that are outside of our normal behavior are suspended so that everybody can have a little celebration. As it turns out, well, campuses have got all upset about things like cultural appropriation. At Queen's University in Canada just the other week, they were going after students who were dressing up as Viet Cong, for example, or Mexicans. It's like, I just don't see what the hell's racist about dressing up like a Mexican. Mexicans have a traditional clothing. There's nothing wrong with Mexicans, so why is it wrong to dress up like them?
Right.
And
if you want to be Pancho Villa for Halloween, what's wrong with that?
well, you can regard that as an homage just as much as a denigration. It's
Absolutely.
like, why is that such a problem?
Right.
But anyways, it doesn't matter because nothing's too trivial to be a problem to a social justice warrior, and because they don't like to deal with real problems. And Yale went after Halloween costumes.
So this woman wrote a letter saying maybe we should just relax about this stuff and don't put restrictions on what people wear for Halloween, but let people decide what is and isn't offensive.
Yes, and many Halloween costumes are offensive. That's the point.
But her letter was really reasonable.
Yeah, it was perfectly reasonable. It was like an adult wrote it.
Yes.
Yeah, and all hell broke loose.
All hell broke loose.
And she ended up quitting.
And I think he did. Did
no,
he
I don't
leave?
think I don't think he left. I don't think he left, but she did.
Seeing him bow down to this woman screaming at him, swearing in his face, was so disturbing. It was so humiliating. I felt so humiliated for him because she was screaming, "This is our home. What the fuck are you doing? You're not making this safe."
And it's not her bloody home. The university's not a home.
Right.
It's not a safe space. It's not a secure space. None of that. And if that when a university isn't a home, that's not what it is. It's a place to be confronted by, I would say, often horrible ideas. You want to learn about history? You think that's going to be safe? Do you know what human history is like? It's an endless bloodbath with a certain amount of hopeful progress underlying it. It's a horror show, and great literature is like that, and biology is terrifying, and physics is terrifying, and you want to be safe. It's stay home with your mom, stay home with your dad. Don't come to university if you want to be safe. Because
don't even go outside.
No, if the university is going to make you safe, then it ceased to be a university. So one of the things I try to do in my class, I have this class called Maps of Meaning, which concentrates on atrocity, basically, on Soviet atrocity and Nazi atrocity mostly. And what I try to do in the class is to teach my students that had they been in Nazi Germany in the 1930s, they would have been Nazis. And had they been offered the opportunity to be an Auschwitz camp guard, then maybe they would have leapt at it. And maybe they would have been in the more sadistic proportion of the Auschwitz camp guard population. You think that makes you feel safe? It doesn't make you feel safe to know that Nazis were humans and you happen to be one of them. So I think that educators that tell students that they're offering them a safe space are doing them a profound disservice. And